guys, welcome to Better Bachelor. My name is Joker with a face for radio and a voice for print. I'm going to start doing a little bit more, I don't know if you'd call them news-ish stories or just kind of articles and information I find as I surf the web for the craziness that is my life and the content that I do. But a lot of times I come across this stuff and I say, well, is this men's content? And then when we're talking about finances or collapse or tough times or bad times happening, I say, yeah, this is something I think that should be shared. The story I have here, if you remember sometime, I think late last year, October-ish maybe, November, something like that, I talked about Sri Lanka and some of these other countries that went with the ESG and diversity hires and everything else, how they're starting to collapse. Well, it seems now South Africa is coming up, and it may be the next to collapse. If any of you are in South Africa, I would love for you to post down below. Give us a detailed update. I will happily pin that underneath the video so we can get more information. This is a thread that I found as I was searching the interwebs from a guy named Zombieland. He's K9_Reaper. He says he's urban ops focused on conflict within South Africa. He's a first responder and a volunteer. And apparently he lives there and kind of keeps his nose on the ground. And I think this can be a foretelling of the bad times to come. And a lot of times, you know, it's very easy to get to a place where you say, you know what, that'll never happen here. Now, granted, South Africa is much more, has many more issues than many westernized countries, but it's already starting to pop up even in Western countries a little bit. And so is South Africa the canary in the coal mine? Is it what's going to eventually happen in another 2, 3, 5, 10 years here in the United States or in Western Europe or in Australia or New Zealand, whatever? That's why I think it's important we talk about things, again, so maybe you can start aligning your short, middle, long-term plans to be prepared for stuff like this. So he says, South Africa has collapsed. Here's why. He says, Part 1, intro, wasteland, societal collapse, final outcome, and Part 5, doing good. So he says, Part 1, South Africa is a beautiful country and home to many unique languages and cultures such as Afrikaner or Boer. We have a base load of around 70 million people. Access to both sea and land trade are considered a great tourist destination. We live in a truly beautiful country, a place like no other. Our winters are short and summers long. Our country is huge, too. I love this land, as did my forefathers who built it. But here's what they're not telling you. He says, buckle up. Our infrastructure is just short of completely obliterated. Infrastructure required for immediate and long-term access to life in general is either non-existent or hanging in by a string. Here's the short list. Sewage treatment works. More than half are offline, and those that are working aren't effective. And then he has, now for all of you just listening, he has links to the stories, the news articles that he's reporting from. Let me just pause here and say, are we not seeing rail derailments? Almost 1,000 a year here in the United States. Of course, we just had what happened in Palestine, Ohio. But there's been videos. Matter of fact, I posted one on my Twitter page where you can see trains derailing, where the wooden ties that are under the railroad tracks are getting shifted to the point where the tracks are now uneven. They go up and go down. They wiggle left and right. And trains are having to slow down to 5 and 10 miles an hour just to get through. And the video I have on my Twitter feed shows one that just a couple of ties wiggle out from underneath it. There's a sag, and the whole train just slowly rolls off the track. It happened in Michigan last year. We're supposedly spending $1 trillion of our money for infrastructure. Biden said he was going to do this about 2 years ago, yet nothing has changed. Where did that money go? Just something to keep in mind. He says water processing works. Of the millions of kilometers of piping, we only have an average of 64% access rate to fresh drinking water. He said the system's dying. Blackouts are making it worse. And again, another link to the national water crisis. The electrical grid. By now, most of you know that South Africa is going through load shedding, where government turns off large parts of the electrical grid in order to avoid grid collapse. This leads to every possible issue imaginable. And again, he has another link to a story. We're seeing this in California. We saw this with the Green Initiative down in Texas when it hit a freeze and all the wind generators just stopped producing energy. We're seeing this now in the UK, where a lot of businesses, steel manufacturers, other manufacturer facilities, are either lessening their load output or they're shutting down completely because electricity and power and heating and gas is getting so expensive that they're struggling to stay operating. Now, granted, the prices have come back a little bit. They're not as bad as they were, but this really isn't the season that you need to worry about. It's going to be the following year, I think, is when things are going to fall off the offline. He says, with the above rolling blackouts, correct term for load shedding, comes less water, no communications, and just complete decay of jobs and hope. It's a sad picture where you go an average of 8 to 12 hours a day without power, and sometimes without power or water for days. And I will mention this too. If your power goes out for half the day, food, even in your refrigerators and other things, are going to spoil. Production plants offline, which makes food and other things getting harder and harder to both produce, buy, store, and eat and cook. He said almost every single state-run enterprise is defunct. They're literally the spitting image of Zimbabwe. Our only power, ESKOM, our only power producer, is dead in the water, averaging a 50% or less power output. A complete lack of maintenance, corruption leads to bankruptcy, and literally sabotaging of general plants has led to this. Now, something I do want to mention is what happened last year here in the United States. The oil pipeline, or actually it was post-processing, so the gasoline manufacturing plants that had a bunch of pipes and pipelines, that got hacked not last year, but the year before that. I know this because I was driving my bus across country, and a lot of the diesel stops that I pulled into were out of diesel fuel, and that was only 20% of our capacity was taken out. And there were truckers that were sitting there sometimes waiting, because if you get low enough on fuel and there's no fuel, you can't drive anywhere. So there were truckers that were stuck delivering goods, and they couldn't go anywhere. They had enough fuel they could run their refrigerant or whatever for the trailers they were towing, but that was it. Well, what happens, and one of the reasons why they said they had such a hard time getting things fixed, and they actually ended up paying the ransom, is because they didn't have enough people that knew how to run things manually. They had these computer systems that have been around for a decade or two that are kind of automatically doing everything, and when those went offline, the men that built these lines and knew how to manually run them were retired. They weren't around anymore, and they weren't training new people to fix this. How much longer does that last for? Until eventually the computer goes down and they say, we can't fix this. It sounds crazy, but we saw a little sampling of that just 2 years ago. He says our rail is dead, quarter of our freight gone in not even 5 years. But it's worse now. The rail just isn't there anymore. It's gone, stolen. Every piece of available track, copper cable, and scrap metal is gone. And this is from the BBC. The article he links to South Africa's railways, how thieves have destroyed the network. And I will pop over to another thread that he has. And he says Houtkopen station had 11 copper cables stolen last night. I warned 2 years ago that copper cable theft would only increase. Eventually it will get to a point where replacing them is not possible, and your area goes without power indefinitely. Now, you can say, well, that sounds like a far cry from here. Nope, already happening in California. The electric car substations for Tesla and these others that are charging cars at several hundred kilowatts of power have massive, massive copper cables. Those copper cables are being cut and stolen, so you now have a Tesla supercharger that has no cable. To replace them, they have to show up with a new cable that takes special processing, and I don't know what they have to do for regulations and inspections and everything else. Those cables cost about $2,000 to install. The copper in each cable is worth roughly about $100. But the copper's already being stolen from some of these Tesla locations, these superchargers in California. What happens when things start going down? The thieves show up. We know about guys stealing catalytic converters for, I think it's the platinum in them. That's been a thing for a while. So you're already seeing samplings of this, very small, but when things get bad, it gets worse. He says the rail network is so dead that land grabbers are setting up shacks on the tracks. And I don't know if you guys have seen the video and the photos of, I think it was California, where people were, as the trains slowed down to go through Los Angeles, people were hopping on the trains, opening the car doors, and throwing items out that were from, Amazon and other shipping containers, and they were looting the trains as they slowed down to go through the area. This happened, last year, the year before, in the bug lockdowns. Add to that the problems we're having with all these trains crashing and not keeping up on the tracks right here in the United States, and then combine that with a diesel shortage and the price of food going up and the other issues, you can see just the whisperings of kind of the same things happening here in the United States. Add to that all the people that are retiring or leaving the workforce, and no young people being taught on this stuff because they want to be influencers, and you can see that problem multiplying. He said, working roads, what's that? Our roads are basically just one giant pothole and nothing else. I don't want to repeat it, but our roads have collapsed. At some stage, they even ran out of tar to facilitate repairs. And again, a link to another story from businesstech.co.za. Africa's roads are collapsing. I've been in Peru. I've been in Egypt. I've been in some of these other countries that are not as affluent as the United States. The roads are horrible. So what happens when you can't transport things by road or rail or plane? We saw the FAA just had a malfunction with one of their systems that grounded planes for a couple of days. Now, we were able to fix it, but what happens when you can't? It's a very fragile system. And if any part of that link breaks down, if you're in a city, no food, maybe no water, maybe no septic, maybe no electric. And again, if you think I'm being hyperbolic, look at California. During the summertime, they have rolling blackouts because too many people are using air conditioning, and they shut down the ability to charge your electric car. But also, if you don't have an electric car, you can't buy a gasoline one after the year 2030 or whatever. So they're going to force you to go to electric cars. And then on the current grid that they have in California and some of these western states, they're not able to support their own grid. That's right now. That's not, way off in the future. That's happening now. What happens when they continue? He said South Africa's port infrastructure slowly dying, workers constantly on strike, IT-related attacks and fires, all crumbling. Our ports are hemorrhaging money by the day. Again, California. We had all the shipping containers, the dock workers, I don't know if they went on strike or they couldn't work because of the lockdowns and the jabs. There were 300 at one point, 300 or 400 ships just sitting outside of the California ports, unable to load their wares, and so shipping costs have skyrocketed. City Power, our biggest grid repairer, is almost non-operational. They also no longer do night shift due to the attacks on employees and lack of funds. They also used up their budget for the year. Now, this is February 28th, and they're out of budget. The employees don't want to work at night because of the crime. And this is at City Power. Why the crime? They're stealing all the cabling for the copper money, for the money they can get for selling this copper. Our substations are collapsing, either exploding, set on fire, or just disappearing into the ground. Okay, well, I don't know if you guys pay attention to the news. It happened, I think, in North Carolina, where there was 100,000 people. Maybe it was 10,000 people. I don't remember, but it was a very large number of people that were without power for several days because somebody went by and took pot shots at the transformers at a substation and took it offline. There were some people that were arrested out on the West Coast for the same thing. And I think the other one was, I don't remember if it was Arizona, Oklahoma or something. We've got people that are going around and trying to take out power substations. I don't know if they're climate activists or what they are. Same things happening here. Again, just a much smaller, a much smaller amount and a smaller effect. But what happens when it gets ramped up? He says, part 3, societal collapse. This is where we are right now. He says, the police force, non-existent. No operational call centers apart from WC. Most police stations don't even pick up the phone. We call them to fetch bodies. That's it. Not enough cops that care, no good cops, no money left for them. What do we see happening here? Protests, riots, fights. Cops don't even show up. If you look at Austin, I know I've seen it in Austin and I've seen it in California, where people are going to these huge intersections and doing the donuts and the street races and other things like that. And a couple of times that the cops show up, it's been one or two cars. There's 1,000 people at these events, doing these illegal drag races and doing donuts in the center of an intersection. The cops got chased off because you can't get out and just start, blasting. And so the cops take off. So now who owns the streets? The criminals. What happened during Bravo Limo Mike and the Summer of Love? And Antifa taking over a section of, was it San Francisco? I think Portland, I forget. They got into it with cops for federal police outside of a courthouse for 100 days. Every time there's any instance that gives people the right, or gives them at least the belief they have the right to go out and do this, they do, and no one is around to stop them because they come out in such force. So the good cops, because of defunding and everything else, quit these areas, and they move to places like Florida or Texas or, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Wyoming. They're moving to more areas where they're still appreciated, and they're leaving the big cities. So what happens when things continue to collapse in the big cities? We can see crime skyrocket. People are being let out on no bail or low bail. And the cops are just like, you don't want us here anyway. Same thing is happening here, just on a smaller scale. If you're in the UK, and I don't know if they're doing this in Australia, what are the cops doing? Are they stopping all the knifings and the bladings? Nope. But instead, they're going around with rainbow-colored pins and nail polish on as the bobbies arrest people for saying, harmful things on Facebook. But they're not actually stopping real crime. If you look, the underpinnings of it are everywhere. They had no problems locking you in your homes and putting cuffs on you, though, if you said anything bad about the jab or didn't want to comply. But the real crime is going unanswered. He says looting is our national sport. Trucks are targeted, guerrilla warfare style, and stopped on uphills. Objects are then placed behind the wheels so the driver cannot escape. The looting then begins. Now, again, this goes to look at what happened in Buffalo when there was a snowstorm. Stores were getting looted. What happened when Philadelphia won? I think it was it Philly won the playoffs? Looting happened. It happened down in Texas. Something happens with the Bravo Lima Mike crew and people just run into Targets and empty the place. How many videos did we see during that of Walmarts and Targets and just being emptied out? There's videos all over the place of just flash mobs of people now going in, stealing $30,000, $50,000, $100,000 worth of stuff and running out. This is happening right now. They haven't moved on to the trucks, but they're hitting the stores already. It happens so bad now that in California, there's something like, I want to say 8 or 10 Walgreens, which is a drugstore. They're just like, we're not able to prosecute. We can't arrest anybody, and they keep emptying our shelves. So we're just going to close these locations. They're no longer profitable. It's already happening here now. It's just not one big, analysis of everything. It's just you get little snippets of this news and information everywhere. And when you start putting it together, you say, hey, what's happening in South Africa is happening here in the United States. I don't know how much about in other areas of the world, but it's happening all over the place, just in smaller amounts, just in rarer amounts. But what happens when things continue to get worse? It's going to start happening more and more. South Africa averages 3 to 4 harmful citizen-based unrest issues a day, every 24 hours. That includes looting, protests, and riots. We see the same thing happening here. Whether it's baby deletion or, Matt Walsh or a conservative is speaking somewhere where they're having these shows where the Rainbow Coalition shows up and wants to dance for little kids, and now they've got Antifa and armed people standing outside of it. wanting to fight. It's happening here. He said crime rate, one non-consensual physical romance every 10 minutes. 80 people are ended every 24 hours. 3 to 4 kids ended every 24 hours. Average of 70 hijackings a day. 2,500 home invasions 24 hours. At least 4 to 5 CIT heists every week. Just look at the numbers, the population of Chicago, and the numbers aren't as high, but the same kind of similar things are happening in Chicago, in New York, in Los Angeles, in these big cities. He said hospitals almost done, hanging in barely by a thread. And he said tweet limit reached. We'll tag the next set on this somehow, or check my feed for more. And it looks like he's added some more on here. He says every other day a coordinated attack takes place on our water, power, comms infrastructure. He said cable theft is a massive issue here. Electrical copper cable is ripped from the high voltage lines, underground trenches, and substations, all sold for a bit of junk money. Junk mean the junk you put in your veins, the heroin. Drugs are the biggest problem, driving factor of copper cable in SA. And now, so if you even get the power in the substations going, you're going to have to spend how much money to get these cable lines put back into the ground. So even if they get the substation running, the ability to get it to your house is gone. He said there are 30 million people in this country, all receiving some form of government grant. Our population, a grand total of 60 million. God help us, the grant for supporting children is somewhere around R500, which is $28. The poor are basically being paid to have kids. We've talked about this before. All these young kids are now talking about thinking socialism is the way. I've talked about this before. What happens when the takers are more than the givers? You run out of money. And that's what's happening here. There are more people that take than give, and their system's collapsing. The South African government has stated they're not constitutionally bound to provide electricity to the republic, and as a result, not bound to end rolling blackouts either, further increasing societal chaos. EWC and NHI, expropriation without compensation, where the government takes your land and gives it to the previously disadvantaged. The NHI is basically a national health insurance thing where you use the government as medical aid. All of this will be in play soon. We hear about that here in the United States with the reparations. He says, and then people started replying. So that's his whole thread. So you've heard me give several examples of what's going on here in the United States that's kind of similar. But, and we all know what's going on with the fuel systems and electricity over in the UK. It's gotten a lot better than it was at its worst. But what happens if things continue to escalate? They're now talking, Zelensky's now talking about saying, hey, if America is really going to be supportive of our conflict with Russia, you need to start sending bodies over here. You need to start sending people. I think our House or our Senate is voting on drafting women as of today or in the next couple of days. And here we see British supermarkets are rationing fruit and vegetables as the shortages bite. I looked into this story a little bit, and they give you, here they say farmers are struggling with higher energy costs, reducing their ability to grow certain fruits and veggies under the heat. And the other thing that they talk about is the inability to ship vegetables and fruits from other countries in a fast enough time to make them edible. In other words, the shipping chain is slowing down or breaking enough that out-of-season fruits that you might not normally get, like tomatoes in the UK, but they might get them from, say, South America or some other location that can grow tomatoes during the winter or whatever. They're not able to send them. The supply exchange is either breaking down so much that they can't make it happen, or it's so expensive that when the tomatoes do finally make it to market, people look at it and they say, I just can't afford this price. When I see stories like this, I always want to report them to you guys. I'm not saying the world's coming to an end, but you got to keep your nose to the grindstone and hustle and work and find a way to see if you can improve yourself to become more self-reliant. Things are going to get bad. And a lot of times we say, oh boy, we just want to sit back and watch the world burn. But the world, it's fun when you're talking about all the crazy social conflicts that we see. But do you really want to see the world burn if it means that you starve to death, or that you don't have clean water, or that somebody hurts you or ends a family member because they wanted to steal what you have? Depending on how bad things get, you go back to the Great Depression when there was a 50 or 15 or 20 or 25% unemployment rate. South Africa's at 35% right now. But if you look at what happened during the Great Depression, things were really bad for a lot of people. The only difference is today versus back then. Back then, families would go hungry. They would beg for food. They would go down, the men would go down and work as dock workers. They'd make sacrifices to try to feed their family. They'd sell all their furniture and possessions. But today, they're not going to do that. Instead, they're going to arm up. They'll put a barrel to the end of your nose and say, give me your crap or I will end you. Society's not where it was last time there was a bad collapse. Just remember this. Be prepared for this stuff and pay attention to it. We're not there yet here in the West, but what happens in the next year or 3 or 5 or whatever? I think things are going to continue to be bad. So just be prepared for it. This one's a little longer. I'll leave it at that. I think you guys get an idea of it. I appreciate you watching. I hope you guys continue to watch my more relevant stuff instead of just my silly clickbait stuff, because my clickbait stuff gets 500,000 views and then my serious stuff gets 30,000 views. And I think that priority's messed up a little bit. So I hope you guys watch it all, and we'll see you in the next one.